اوکی، با سلام زیاد خدمت همتون. پنل بعدی رو شروع میکنیم. این پنل مربوط میشه به ادبیات معاصر ایران و نقش زنان در تولید این ادبیات و در شرکتش در این ادبیات. در حال دوستان عزیزی که اینجا هستن من معرفی میکنم خدمتتون. اول از همه صحبت خانم پروفسور نسرین رحمیه رو میشنویم که از UC ایروان اینجا هستن و تخصصشون در کار comparative literature هست و women's studies, Iranian cinema, Iranian literature after the revolution. She is the author of a number of many articles, reviews, books, and I think you can get more information if you just take a look at the pamphlet that was given out. Each speaker will be introduced at relative length there, so we won't take the time here to introduce our speakers. Dr. Rahimieh will be the first to start our panel. Next we have Dr. Ava Omar, who cannot be with us. چطور بخش آوا اوما رو فارسی بگم؟ چون ایشون نوشتهشون به فارسیه. ولی تونستن که برای ما یه ریکوردینگی از مقاله‌ای که می‌خواستن به ما ارائه بدن برای ما میفرستن و به موقع وقتی که پخش میشه شاید دوباره این خانم رو معرفی کنم خدمتتون. نوشته ایشون به فارسی. Next we come to Dr. Jasmine Meek, who is here with us. She's an author, she's a journalist, and her recent book is out. And I'm sure it's available out there, right? You can sign up for it. Yeah, she has recently written this book called The Song of Captive Bird, which has a strong reference to Farrowson, her life, and kind of fictionalized her life in this authentic piece of work. So I recommend we all take a look at this recently published book. And she, in her book, is focusing on the life of Farrowson, who was in her own time an avant-garde woman who defied many of the social norms and the expectations of that society at the time, and her influence can still be seen both on literature and also on women's lives. So let's begin. We'll each have 20 minutes to present our cases here, and then we'll open up for questions and answers. Okay?
صدا میاد؟ اوکی. فقط می‌خواستم تشکر کنم از همه دوستانی که چقدر زحمت کشیدن این برنامه رو برگزار کنن. And I am going to switch to English. When Tarajun invited me, I said, oh no, I can't possibly come because all of my work for the past 40 years, well, all my writing has been in English. And I'm miserable at translating myself. But she was kind enough to say, no, no, come, it's fine. You can speak English. So. The flourishing of Iranian women's writing in the wake of the 1979 revolution is widely recognized. Iranian women have by and large established themselves as integral to the Iranian literary scene. What's less discussed is whether this phenomenon is itself a reflection or a byproduct of the revolution and what it might reveal about women's perception of their place in the national imaginary. In this presentation, I'm going to analyze a very small selection, the emphasis on small, of contemporary prose pieces by Zoya Pirzad and Fariba Wafi to pinpoint how nearly 4 decades after the revolution that resulted in the curtailing of women's rights and women's participation in public life, space, be it actual or metaphoric, I'm sorry, I lost my place. Women's literary representations, how after this time that women's literary representations engage with their place in the national public space. Of course, there are a great varieties of works written. I'm only focusing on 2 writers and 2 pieces by them. So keep that in mind, that my comments are not meant to be necessarily comprehensive and about every writer imaginable. It goes without saying that long before women wrote about their position in the space of home and the nation, they were written about and placed primarily in domestic spaces. Not surprisingly, women's foray in modern Persian literature grappled with representation of domesticity and how they occupy and are or socially and culturally conditioned to configure themselves in the space of home. What's different in the new writing by women is the way the domestic space itself is represented, or I would say problematized. Before I turn to two examples from specific works, let me just move back in time slightly and give a sense of how domesticity we might recall that in women's writing before the revolution. In my view, there's no better example to turn to than Simin Daneshvar's famous and very popular novel, Suveshun, published in 1969. The protagonist, you recall, I'll just go skimming quickly, Azadeh is depicted as an educated, free-spirited, headstrong woman who after her marriage becomes devoted to her husband and her children. The novel is set during the Second World War, and more specifically when the southern part of half of the nation where the novel takes place is occupied by British forces. The political turmoil of the time inevitably seeps into the family's domestic life. While Zarih's husband, Yusuf, is engaged on the political scene, Zarih adheres to her domestic responsibilities. I'd like to quote a passage from the novel in which Zarih enters a room where her husband and his friends and political allies are meeting secretly to organize armed resistance against the British occupying forces and their Iranian collaborators. I quote, and this is a translation by our dear colleague, Moghanu Parva. She entered the room and put the hookah in front of her husband. With the doors closed, the air in the parlor was warm, and sweat was beading on everyone's foreheads and noses. Zarih went to the cupboard, brought out straw fans, and put them on the table. Then she took small plates, knives, and forks out of the cupboard and set the table so quietly that she made almost no noise. It was strange. Zarih had just cut open 2 watermelons, and both turned out yellow and unripe. She took this as a bad omen. The 3rd watermelon was not bad. She was about to cut the edges in zigzags, but she thought, who's going to look at the zigzag shape of the watermelon now? She put the larger plate of watermelon next to the map of Iran that they had spread on the table, where they were all bending over and looking at. End of quote. This part of the novel ends with Zarih being asked by her husband, loving husband, albeit indirectly, to leave them. Even when outside forces intrude into her sphere, Zarih's sphere, and she is called upon to extend hospitality to the guests, she remains a hostess and a caretaker, hovering at the edges of the discussion about the nation's future. As the men pore over the map of Iran, Zarih considers cutting the watermelon into decorative pieces. Just this juxtaposition of the metaphoric carving out of the nation by foreign and native forces, and Zarih's limited reach to carving up of food and nourishment for the men defending the nation, delineates women's role in the project of the formation of a modern nation. When her husband is killed, Zarih musters up the courage to face the hostile forces beyond her home. But the novel ends on the note of mourning and burial. Now, turning now to contemporary short stories and novels, we also find women in the domestic sphere and caught up in the demands of home and family. One of the better known contemporary writers, and I'm sure all you know of her, is Zoya Pirzad, an Armenian-Iranian writer, some of whose works have been translated into English. I'm going to go directly to one particular collection of interconnected stories entitled The Acrid Taste of Persimmons. And this is not translated into English. The title in Persian is Tam Yas Khormalu. I turn to one story to further illustrate the point about the fate of women. In one of the stories, the central character is a woman named Mahnaz, who is about to leave her husband, Farrowson. As Mahnaz sits at the kitchen table reminiscing about their life together, she recalls one particular dinner party she and Farrowson gave. The guest list was made up of Farrowson's superiors at work, and the dinner party was intended to represent him at his best. Having taken into account his various injunctions about what to serve, Mahnaz slaves for a week to prepare for an evening she remembers this way. And I quote from the story. When the guests arrived and were seated, Farrowson motioned toward the kitchen with his head, and Mahnaz served tea. Then Farrowson glanced in the direction of the nut dish, and Mahnaz served the guests the nuts. Then she brought out the appetizers. For a second time, she served tea to everyone, with the exception of the managing director's wife, who only wanted hot water. Farrowson glanced at the dining table, and Mahnaz cleared away the appetizers. In her trips back and forth between the kitchen and the parlor, she heard the men talking about their company. The women listened in silence. Mahnaz was just wondering why the women weren't talking when Farrowson said, "Mahnaz June, why are you going back and forth so much? The ladies are bored. Come sit down with them, and come sit down and chat with them." End of quote. The pace of the evening and the execution of Farrowson's orders encapsulate Mahnaz's married life. The event goes almost completely according to plan, until Mahnaz ventures an opinion about what the men are discussing among themselves. It's hard to hold on to this, but she intervenes to offer them a business solution. She tells them that their company could rent air-conditioned containers for transportation of fruit that typically goes rotting before it makes it to the stores. After the guests have left, Farrowson tells Mahnaz, "My dear, you were a great hostess this evening. Except the beans. Your beans were a little undercooked. And I think you added too much garlic to the chicken. I'm just saying this for the sake of next time. And by the way, speaking of the next time, please don't ever speak of the company's business to my boss. He doesn't like women interfering in work." End of quote. With this assertion, Farrowson introduces a clear demarcation between men and women's work. This division of labor, masterfully performed and celebrated in Farrowson, rings hollow in this story. Not only is Mahnaz's work not confined to the realm of the apartment, she is also subject to Farrowson's assertion of authority on what could be considered women's domestic concerns. The passage I just quoted from about the dinner party demonstrates his obsessive concern about how food must be served, as do most of his exchanges with Mahnaz about all manner of house-related chores, from how to dust furniture, how to make tea, and when to wash the curtains. This is not so much a role reversal as a sign of gender crisis. As his perceived field of power is impinged upon by his wife, Farrowson is increasingly drawn to incursions into what he believes to be Mahnaz's primary or proper domain of labor and authority. But the trouble with this mode of extending his power is that it does not have the desired effect on Mahnaz. She does not recognize the boundaries that are so fundamental to Farrowson's self-actualization and acts on her instinct against his injunction. She holds on to her job, opts against having children, and uses her inheritance to buy an apartment for herself, and then promptly divorce him. Mahnaz has the economic means and the possibility of having a room of her own to exit this troubled marriage. What this particular domestic drama underscores is the calm detachment with which Mahnaz reflects on the life she has decided to renounce. She shows no desire to reconfigure her place in the marriage, nor does she exhibit any sentimentalism about the life she's leaving behind. What matters most is that she remove herself from that space. Now I turn to Fariba Wafi's short story, Thousands of Brides, Hezaran Arus. And it represents a vexed situation. The protagonist is denied a personal identification through a name. She is known simply as the bride, Arus, who moves into her husband's family home where she lives with her husband on the second story of her in-laws' house. She's shy and reclusive, and her meddling sister-in-law and other members of the extended family struggle to understand the reason for her aloofness. And she, Arus, that is, reflects on the conditions that discourage her developing closer ties to her husband's family. I quote, "In the very first months of moving into this house, she understood that she would never become friends with her sister-in-law, Gohar. Something got in the way. It took her some time to pinpoint. Her mother-in-law, who fired the first salvo when she forgot her first name, called out, 'Oh, bride, come downstairs.' In subsequent days, she became accustomed to being called the bride. No matter what, she was the bride. And one day she understood that the bride is not one person. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of other brides. Gradually, she learned that the bride has a world of connotations, most of which did not apply to her, but rather hundreds of brides before her. And she understood that whatever she does is accompanied by the shadow of memories and actions and manners of earlier brides. It took her time to realize that escaping this ready-made mold would be difficult, and equally difficult to demonstrate and prove that she is different and not like all other brides, that she's a person who has to be described anew, not dragging along prior definitions. Her every act would be ascribed to her being a bride. She would be judged in terms of being a bride, not being her own self." End of quote. It's interesting to note that even within the interior monologues in this woman is deprived of a name. So that is, Fariba Wafi doesn't give her a name either. Her entire existence becomes set against the tribe, Qabile, bent on banding together to make fun of her and make her feel isolated. Their favorite subject is the bride's propensity for constipation, which leads her to spending long stretches of time in the bathroom, and the house has only one bathroom. Her bathroom habits become the subject of jokes, further alienating her from the family. To avoid drawing attention to herself before going to the bathroom, the bride would first always survey the parlor and calculate how likely it would be that somebody would be in the bathroom, or she would have enough time to make it back. Sooner or later, someone would notice her absence, and thus would begin the loud laughter and exchange of pleasantries that would mortify her. On other occasions, the members of the family offer suggested remedies. As the years pass by, the gulf separating the bride from her in-laws widens. Her only reprieve comes in the form of being forgotten, and on occasions she's slips away and goes upstairs to be alone. Even when she becomes a mother and thinks she might be given a little bit more room, or a room of her own, to focus on her child, she finds herself surrounded by her husband's tribe. She longs to leave the house, and when she shares her dream of living in their own house, her husband is surprised at her ungratefulness. Her identity as the bride is sealed in the space that is overdetermined by the husband's tribe. The more she retreats from the collectivity, the more they intrude on her space. One fall day, after she sweeps the leaves off the courtyard, she quietly enters the bathroom, content that no one is in sight. Overcome with cramps she hopes to find relief from, but before long, her sister-in-law appears in the courtyard, and after making inquiries says, "Have you rented the bathroom again? Do something about that rear end." Before long, she finds herself barricaded against the tribe and their admonishment that she has not tried the many remedies that they had suggested for curing her constipation. When they hear the bride crying inside the bathroom, her sister-in-law, who has been so meddlesome, insists on going in to try to help her. I'll spare you the gory parts of the story. It consists of the sister-in-law rushing to the pharmacy and getting an enema pump and so on. The others heard their voices from outside. One frail voice overcome with shame, and the other commanding a manly voice. This marks the penultimate sentence of the story, which ends with, I quote, "A year later, they move out of the house. The bride stayed the bride, but the relationship with the sister-in-law changed." This final sentence hints at the formation of a new relationship. One could say a sort of intimacy is formed between them. Bafi's story makes a bold move by situating the problems of women's subjectivity in the unlikely space of a bathroom. Compared to the public space in which the protagonist of Donna Schwartz's 1969 novel is propelled, this could be seen as banal. At the end of Suashun, Zari finds herself continuing her husband's battle against the forces of imperialism, while at the end of Bafi's story, we see an indistinct bride move from the interior of one house to another, her identity apparently not changed. Neither of Zoya and Pirzad's protagonists ever rises above their daily routines, or Bafi's I should say, although Mahnaz quietly leaves her marriage. In fact, the subdued and far from heroic fictional figures, the two figures I have introduced today, seem to be far removed from the lofty ideas of the protagonists of the novels and short stories from before the revolution. I would suggest that this turn to representing the ordinary, banal, and routine ways rather in which women's subjectivity is circumscribed is itself revolutionary, at least in the context of the history of Iranian women's writing. Is it because the project of the revolution failed women so badly? Or can we decipher and move away from assuming that women's liberation and national revelation are synonymous? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nasreen, for that lovely presentation. Next, we have our second speaker who is not able to be with us today, so we'll have her voice brought to us, right? Okay. Just to give you a very brief information about Agha Homa. آقا هما از کردهای ایرانی خیلی خوب کردی حرف میزنه و مشکل کردهای ایران رو، مسئله حقوق بشر رو در مورد این جامعه به نحو احسن تو این مقاله ها و نوشته ها و گفته های خودش بیان میکنه. مضافنی خانمی است که در مورد فعالیت های زنان و فعالیت های human rights و اینها بسیار فعاله و کتابی داره که عنوانش هست Echoes from the Other Land و این به انگلیسیه اگر مایل بودی که دنبال کنید.
تعارف نکنید.
صدا رو لطفاً بلند کنید.
بحث امروز من در مورد ادبیات و مقاومت هست. عرض سلام و ادب خدمت شرکت کننده های کنفرانس، سخنرانان و برگزار کننده ها. عذر میخوام از اینکه نتونستم به خاطر یه سری تا فرصت‌های آینده. بحث امروز من در مورد ادبیات و مقاومت هست و اینکه چطوری زنای ایران در عصر مختلف تونستن به این روش با مرد-سالاری مبارزه کنن و با ستم‌های دیگه اجتماعی و در نهایت رابطه تنگ ادبیات و حجاب رو بررسی می‌کنم. قبل از اینکه به بحث ایران بپردازیم می‌خوام یه نگاهی داشته باشید به وضعیت ادبیات تو سطح جهان و اینکه آیا رابطه‌ای هست اصلا بین ادبیات و زن به طور کلی. شاید این مفهوم برای ما یک مقدار ناآشنا باشه، اما فمینیست‌های غربی مخصوصا فمینیست‌های فرانسوی سال‌هاست که در مورد ارتباط تنگاتنگ بین صدا، بدن و نوشتن صحبت کردن و گفتن که چطوری حذف و سانسور یکی منجر میشه به از بین بردن و به حاشیه روندن دیگری و بالعکس. اگه یه نگاه کلی داشته باشیم می‌بینیم که تو سطح دنیا ادبیات خیلی بهش ارزش داده نشده و به عنوان یک موضوعی که جز لاکچریه و این موضوع سکندری هست بهش نگاه شده. خود افلاطون شعرا رو از مدینه فاضلش قدغن کرد، از طرف اونها یک سری انسان‌های آیدل و بیکار میدونست که کار ارزشمندی نمی‌کنن، از طرفی به قدرت قلم اونا اقرار داشت و می‌ترسید از اینکه اونا بتونن جامعه رو به انحراف بکشونن. همینطور هم که میدونیم هم تو دنیای واقعی هم توی ادبیات دیستوپیا همیشه دیکتاتورها از قلم ترسیدن و جز اولین کسایی که به زندان رفتن و تنبیه شدن نویسنده ها بودن. خب اگر که نگاه میکنیم میبینیم یه تناقض توی این برخورد است. از طرفی به تحقیر میکشونن و نادیده میانگارن و اینو بی اهمیت و بی ارزش جلوه میدن و بپسن. از طرفی ترس عجیبی از قدرتش دارن که خب این دوتا با هم نمیخونه. باز اگر نگاه بکنیم به روشی که رامین جامعه مرد سالار در پیش گرفته در برخورد با زن، همونطوری که سیمین دوبار بهش اشاره کرد سالها پیش، زن به عنوان جنس دوم شناخته شده. زن در واقع اینطوری تعریف میشه که مرد موجود اصلی و حالا زن که زن موجودی که مرد نیست و به این طور بهش نگاه شده و تعریف شده. توی اسطوره ها داریم که حوا از دنده چپ آدم آفریده شد که خب همین خودش قضیه خنده داره، چون اگه اینطوری باشه پس آدم یکی از دنده هاشو از دست داده، اما همیشه اینطوری بهش نگاه شده که زنه که یه دنده کم داره و این یه دنده کم داشتن هم اینطوری تعریف شده که خب پس زن یه تخت عقلش کمه، پس توانایی تفکر و تخیل و خلاقیت و اینا رو نداره. به هر حال از یه طرف زن اینطوری تحقیر شده، از طرفی توی جامعه‌های مختلف بدن زن هم از طرفی سورس فاسینیشن بوده، هم یه چیزی بوده که ازش وحشت عظیمی داشتن و قصد داشتن کنترلش بکنن. میدونیم که توی هندوستان مثلا زنای بیوه رو به آتیش میکشیدن، توی چین پای زنها رو میبستن که پایشون اندازه بیشتر رشد نکنه، پاهاشون کوچیک باشه که خوشگل محسوب بشن. توی آفریقا گردنهای زنها رو میبستن که خواستن گردنشون دراز بشه و باب طبع آقایون باشه. توی غرب از بیماری‌های کم‌خوراکی و بی‌اشتهایی زنان باش درگیرن. توی خاورمیانه خب زنان توی حجاب هم پوشونده میشن، قایم میشن. قضیه ما ختنه زنان رو تو خیلی قسمت‌های دنیا داریم و همونطور که میدونیم همین تناقض ترس و تحقیر کردن همزمان وجود داشته. از طرفی خب تو مهم نیستی به اندازه کافی، از طرفی ما ازت میترسیم. همینطوری اگه نگاه کنیم به ادبیات ایران می‌دونیم که ادبیات ایران یه ادبیات خیلی غنیه، اما به شدت مردها اینو مونوپولایز کردن و چقدر این صدمه زده رو ما. به عنوان یه شما فکرشو بکنید که اگه ما ورژن زنونه حافظ و رومی رو داشتیم، اگه مثلا 10 تا قرمین اعتصامی داشتیم، چقدر ادبیاتمون غنی‌تر می‌شد. از طرفی خب وقتی که زنان نمیتونن بنویسن، دنیای زن‌ها غیر قابل شناخت باقی میمونه برای مرد و این خودش ضربه به ادبیات می‌رسونه. ادیبی و داستان‌نویسی که نتونه شخصیت زنش رو با اون قلایق مختلفشون بشناسه، خب قطعا نویسنده خیلی خوبی از آن در نمیاد. از طرف ما فرصت دیالوگ رو بین زن و مرد نویسنده از دست داره. غیر از اونم خب از صدای زن‌ها همیشه صدایی بوده که خفه شده، استعداد ادبی زن‌ها کشته شده و هیچ نمونه و بروزی ازش توی ادبیاتمون، ادبیات کلاسیک ایرانی نداریم. ولی اینطوری نیست که زن فقط به عنوان سابجکت و تولید کننده اثر محو باشن. حتی می‌بینیم توی آثار توی پرسپولیس زن‌ها حتی به عنوان هدیه‌هایی هم که پادشاه به هم میدن وجود ندارن. یعنی کلاً فیمیل غایبه از کل آثار پرسپولیس با همه اصالتش. حالا میخوام یه نگاه ریزتری داشته باشیم به رابطه بین حجاب و ادبیات. اینجا وقتی من در مورد حجاب صحبت می‌کنم، منظورم حجاب به عنوان یک انتخاب شخصی نیست. به عنوان انتخاب شخصی حجاب میتونه خیلی معانی داشته باشه. میتونه یه سمبل معنوی باشه، میتونه یه اصلا یه طغیان باشه در برابر سیاست‌های امروز دنیا و طرز نگاهی که به خاورمیانه داره و دیونایز کردنش. اینجا پس من توی این سخنرانی هم از حجاب صحبت می‌کنم، منظورم از اون فلسفه هست که زن باید پوشونده بشه که مرد رو از دست خودش نجات بده. پس چون مرد نمیتونه روی خودش کنترل داشته باشه، پس حتما زنها که دلیل انحرافش هستن باید پوشونده بشن. حجاب رو به اون فلسفه دارم بهش نگاه میکنم. خب میدونیم که حجاب اجباری زن رو قایم میکنه، میپوشونه و از طرفی ادبیات و نوشتن نگارش خلاقانه اتفاقا زن رو در معرض قرار میده، در معرض عموم میاره. این طرز نگاه کردن به بدن زن به عنوان منبع شرم و منبع وسوسه دو تا نتیجه حداقل به دنبال داره. یکی اینکه زن رو با بدن خودش غریبه میکنه، چون چیزیه که در موردش حرف زده نمیشه، در موردش اطلاعات وجود نداره، آموزش وجود نداره، نه برای زن نه برای مرد. و همین الان تو همین قرن 21 توی ایران میدونیم که این مشکل بیگانگی با بدن توی دخترای ما و زنای ما هنوز وجود داره. از طرفی خب ادبیات کارش تفکر کردن، بررسی کردن، موشکافی کردن و اتفاقا دقیقاً خلاف پوشوندنه. غیر از اون خود قضیه شرم رو که نگاه بکنیم، زنای ایرانی اول بار که شروع کردن به نوشتن باید به این قضیه شرم غلبه می‌کردن. این دیدگاه که خب زن نباید حرف بزنه، زن که چیزی برای گفتن نداره، زن که اگر که بخواد حرفی برای گفتن داشته باشه پس دلیته است، پس تمام این صفت‌های منفی هست. اگر که به حجاب به عنوان یه دیواری نگاه کنیم، یه دیوار قابل حملی که تفکیک جنسیتی رو با خودش به همراه میبره توی کوچه، میبره توی خیابون، ادبیات در واقع شکننده اون دیوارها و از بین بردن مانع‌هاست و به اشتراک گذاشتن ایده هاست، به وجود آوردن اندیشه و تفکر. هرچی که حجاب باعث از بین رفتن ارتباطات و کامیونیکیشن میشه، اتفاقا ادبیات به وجود آوردن ارتباطات و غلبه کردن روی اون مانع‌هاست. به این ترتیب خود نفس نوشتن یه نفس از بین بردن حجاب و طغیان کردن به اون فلسفه‌ای هست که زن رو میپوشونه و توی اندرونی قرار میده و از حقوق اجتماعیش محروم میکنه. حالا میخوام یه نگاهی دقیق‌تر داشته باشم به ادبیات ایران قبل و بعد از اجباری شدن حجاب و میخوام نگاه کنیم ببینیم آیا این قضیه اجباری شدن حجاب تأثیری روی ادبیات ما داشته، اگر داشته این تأثیر چطوری بوده. اولا که هر جا زنای ما یک دست به نوشتن زدن، بهاشو براش پرداختن و بهایی هم که براش پرداختن بهای ساده و کوچیکی نبوده. اولین زنی که به طور رسمی توی ایران توی اون ملأ عام کشف حجاب کرد یک شاعر بود طاهر قرةالعین و میدونیم هم که اعدام شد. غیر از اون زنها به خاطر نوشتنشون، به خاطر خلق آثار ادبی به زندان رفتن، کشته شدن، به سمت خودکشی کشیده شدن، به تبعید رسوندنشون و یا به عنوان دیوانه و کم عقل و اینا توی جامعه نشون داده شدن. یعنی در واقع این قضیه ناپدید کردن و اینویزیبل کردن زن هم یه قضیه جسمی، هم یه قضیه کلامیه. یعنی هم ساکتش کردن، هم از جامعه محوش کردن. مثلا فرض کنید یکی از اصطلاح خیلی رایج که هنوز هم متاسفانه استفاده میشه، یه اصطلاحی هست به اسم حموم زنانه. این دیدگاه از این دیدگاه نشأت میگیره که زن یه موجودیه که بدون پاز و بدون معنا و بدون هیچی بلبشو میکنه و دراجی میکنه و حرف میزنه و حرفاش هم حرف ارزشمندی نیست، حتما غیبت با چی و چی و هر جا که یک سری بلبشو وجود داره که سر و صدای زیادی هست، کلام زیادی هست، فاقد ارزش بهش میگن حمام زنانه. و این یه چیزیه که برای تحقیر گفته میشه، در صورتی که حمام‌ها زنانه جایی بودن که تنها بودن که زنان میتونستن با هم ارتباط برقرار بکنن، یک صحبتی با هم داشته باشن، هم فکری داشته باشن و غیره. خب جزء دیگه زنان ایرانی که جزء زن بزرگ بودن، جزء اولین زنای پارلمان بودن، خانم فرخون پارسا بودن که در راه حقوق زنان خیلی تلاش کردن و در سال 1979 بعد از انقلاب به جرم فساد فی الارض و اینجور اکاذیب کشته شدن و اعدام شدن. و دیگه اینکه تا همین امروز هر موقع که زنها از برداشتن موانع که اینا رو میخواد ناپدید بکنه حرف زدن، بهشون گفتن که این تمایل شما برای از بین بردن و از برداشتن این پوشش اجباری و طلبتون برای برابری و استقلال دو تهمت همیشه بهش زدن. یعنی گفتن این آرزوی مرداست که میخوان چشترونه بکنن شما رو ببینن، و دیگه اینکه اینا پس یه دیدگاه غربیه. یعنی هیچ موقع دادخواست زنان برای استقلال و برای برابری به جدی انگاشته نشده و همیشه بهش تهمت زده شده. در ادبیاتی که قبل از حجاب اجباری وجود داشتم، تو کار ساواشون سیمین دانشور و کار سیمین بهبهانی اگه بهش نگاه بکنیم، من باز میخوام تایید بکنم که زن ایرانی هر مدل از نوشتنشون یک جور طغیانه. خود نفس نوشتن نفس چیزی بوده که یک حرکت شجاعانه بوده و حتما براش بها پرداختن. شما نگاه میکنید که هنر و ادبیات چیزی نیست که شما بتونید به عنوان لاکچری تو زندگی داشته باشید. در واقع برای داشتن ادبیات قوی و هنر خوب وقف کردن میخوان، زندگی رو وقف کردن میخوان. و این تو جامعه‌ای که توش زن باید همسر فداکار باشه و مادر فداکار باشه، دائم از خود گذشته باشه، خب این دوتا با هم خیلی راحت جور در نمیان و بهای اجتماعی که زن براش پرداختن خیلی زیاده. و اون شرایطی که ویرجینیا وولف میگه که زن بهش احتیاج دارن برای خلق ادبی که داشتن رومافونز، اون پرایوسی اینا برای زن ایران وجود نداشته. با این حال ما زنای بزرگی داشتیم مثل سیمین دانشور، سیمین بهبهانی که ادبیات خوبی خلق کردن، اما چیزی که توش وجود داره اینه که ادبیات به عنوان یه آگاهی فمینیستی توی کارهای این نویسنده‌ها وجود نداره. در واقع ادبیاتشون بیشتر میشه گفت ادبیات متعهده، اون چیزی که توی اندیشه چپ و مارکسیستی بهش یاد میشه که ادبیات با قلم میتونه استفاده بشه برای مبارزه با ستم و برابری اجتماعی و حرف از انقلاب و غیره و غیره. پس این مدت قبل از انقلاب اسلامی می‌بینیم که ادبیات زنان هم تا حد زیادی در خدمت اینه و مثلا زیبایی شناسی براش مهم نیست، بیشتر فرم براش مهم نیست، بیشتر همون نوشتن در خدمت جامعه است. اما اتفاقی که افتاد این بود که بعد از انقلاب حجاب اومد و اجباری شد. یهویی نصف جامعه بهشون دستور داده شد که حالا شما باید از این به بعد اگر که اینطوری هم شروع کردید کارمند هستید باید روسری سرتون بکنید. خب اینا زن ایرانی ساکت ننشستن، اعتراضای بزرگی داشتن توی 8 مارس، اما یه اتفاق خیلی بزرگ افتاد اینجا. اتفاقی که افتاد این بود که زن ایرانی متوجه شدن چقدر تنها متوجه شدم روزی که اومدن به اعتراض کردن به حجاب اجباری، هم چپ ها، هم راست ها، هم کمونیست ها، هم اسلامیست ها و هم مرد ها همه ساکت موندن. یعنی هیچ کدوم اعتراض اینا را جدی نگرفتن، کمکشون نکردن و در نهایت این چماقداران ها اومدن و سرکوبشون کردن و الان چیزی بوده 40 ساله که حجاب داره اجباری میشه که از رو سرش رو شد بعد به حجاب برتر و اینا کشیده شد. اما این آگاهی که زنها پیدا کردن که فهمیدن که نه، درسته که دردهای اجتماعی و اقتصادی و سیاسی رو زن و مرد با هم به دوش میکشه. یک سری دردها هستن که زنها به تنهایی به دوش میکشن و مردها الزاماً به خاطر اینکه همسنگر چپشون هستن یا تو راههای دیگه باشون همراهن الزاماً آگاه به دغدغه‌ها و درک‌های اینا نیستن و توی جنبشایی که بخواد حق زنان رو به طور اخص بهش بررسی بکنه یا به حاشیه کشیده میشه یا درجه 2 قرار گرفته میشه یا در بهترین حالت اصلا کلا نادیده گرفته میشه. و جالبه که پارادوکسیکلی بعد از اینکه حجاب اجباری شد اتفاقا یه طغیانی توی این کشف حجاب ادبی شد، به این معنی که به طرز عجیبی یه تعداد نویسنده زن نوشتن درباره زن و اینا خیلی زیاد شد. بین سال 1983 و 85 126 تا کتاب توسط زنان درباره زنان چاپ شد و این در حال اتفاق میفته که اون هم اولا کمبود کاغذ است و اون سانسورهای عجیب و غریبی روی مطالب نوشته شده است که دولت روی هر چیزی هست که چاپ میشه نظارت داره. و غیر از این میزان انتشار در مورد زن و توسط زن، چیزی که عوض شد آگاهی فمینیستی بود که به آثار زن ایرانی اومد. که همونطور که می‌دونیم مثلا کار زنان بدون مردان شرمش پارسی پور یا تو با معنی شبش که با ساختار بازی میکنه و با به ستم جنسی و ستم جنسیتی اعتراض میکنه به نفس خیلی فرق داره با نوع ادبیاتی که توی زمان قبل از انقلاب عرضه میشه. در پایان بخش پایانی حرفا میخوام در مورد صحبت بکنم که خود من به عنوان یک زن کرد ایرانی که در خارج از کشور زندگی میکنم چرا می‌نویسم و حالا از نوشتن چیه؟ خب اولا که نوشتن یه جور خلاقیت و کشف کردن، همون کشف‌های درونی، همین نگاه از درون به بیرونه که من میتونم توسط اون اولا با خلاقیت رشد کنم و زندگیمو بهش غنا ببخشم و خودم رو بشناسم، دور و برم رو بشناسم. غیر از اون خب من به عنوان یه زن، مثلا یه زن خاورمیانه‌ای، یه زن ایرانی، نوشتم برای اینکه اعتراضی از اون خفقان چند صده‌ای که زنان و مادران و بزرگان ما روش کشیدن. به عنوان یک زن اقلیت خب من فقط برای دنیای بیرون شناخته شده نیستم. در واقع همونطور که می‌دونید مثلا زن بلوچ، زن عرب، زن ترک، ترکمن، اینا دنیاشون و دغدغه‌هاشون اونقدر شناخته شده نیست توی ادبیات ما که مثلا دغدغه زن مرکز نشینه. به همین ترتیب ادبیات برای من در واقع گفتن داستانایی که گفته نشده و آگاهی بخشیدن و صدایی بودن برای زن اقلیت ایرانی. خب غیر از اون چون تو جامعه غربی هم زندگی میکنم، باز به عنوان یک زنی که جهان سومی هست، نوشتن برای من اعتراض به دو چیزه. یکی اعتراض به این که همیشه در مورد ما نوشته شده، خیلی کم شده که ما بتونیم در مورد خودمون بنویسیم و نوشتن من و نوشتن بقیه زنای ایرانی و بقیه زنای کرد، بقیه زنای اقلیت و کلا بقیه زنای توی کشورهای در حال توسعه، همین گفتنه که ما میتونیم در مورد خودمون صحبت بکنیم و نظر شما در مورد صحبت بکنیم. و خب غیر از اون هم میدونیم که مثلا توی آمریکا چیزی حدود 1% ادبیاتی که رمان‌هایی که چاپ میشه نویسنده‌هاش هیسپانیکن، حتی یعنی نویسنده خاورمیانه حتی به 1% هم نمیرسن. خب پس در واقع غنا بخشیدن به ادبیات کشوری هم هست که توش ساکنن و تقویت کردن دایورسیتیه و خیلی دلایل دیگه که من اینجا چند تاشو نقل کردم. اینا منابع من هستن، از آثار ادبی و نقطه ادبی استفاده کردم و این وبسایت منه. بازم باز میخوام از اینکه نتونستم حضوری در خدمتتون باشم خواهش میکنم هر سوالی دارید به من ایمیل بکنید، من با کمال میل به سوالاتون جواب میدم. خیلی ممنون، روز ساعت خوبی داشته باشید.
ساعت تموم کرد بسیار عالی بود. اگر اجازه بدید سوال و بحث راجع به این پرزنتیشنی که خانم آوا اینجا داشت رو میذاریم به بعد از اینکه تمام پیپرهای پنلیست تمام میشه.
Hello, salam دوستان عزیز. With your permission, I'm going to speak in English as well and apologize. My mom's not here. She'd be mortified that I'm speaking in English. But it's been such a wonderful day, and I want to say there's nothing that lifts my heart like seeing Iranian women succeeding and telling their stories. So it's been a really special day, and I'm really honored and touched to be here. You weren't kidding. It's hard. Does it work? Actually, you don't have to press it down. No? So I'm going to talk to you a bit about my writing. I'm a novelist and a memoirist and an essayist. I'm going to talk to you also about one of my great heroes, and that's Farrowson. Many of you know about her, and I'm going to talk a little bit about the visual artist Sharina Shaw, who you probably also know pretty well too. So let me start out with a little bit of a confession, which is that every time I started to think about what I wanted to tell you all today, I would start to put down some thoughts, and then I would stop, and then I would start to put down some thoughts, and I would stop. And as all of you know, if you've ever tried to write, it's sort of par for the course. Writing is hard, but I'd say nowadays it's especially hard. I think the question that comes to mind as I'm writing, and the reason it's so difficult, is I keep thinking, who cares? How can what I do, telling stories, writing, possibly help in this world that's in such a state of profound chaos? Shouldn't I be out there, that's out there, making some kind of real difference instead of just writing down words on a page or even speaking them to other people? Every single artist or writer that I know nowadays is thinking about this. I mean, it's really all we're talking about. We're not writing, we're talking about how we don't know if what we do matters anymore. How can we create from inside of this madness, from inside of this devastation? How can we make meaning when things feel so meaningless? We walk around, we're often quiet, we're often checking Facebook or Instagram, pick your poison, Twitter. Instead of writing, these are the things that we're doing. I think what we're trying to do is metabolize a level of collective trauma and rage and confusion that just is impossible to absorb. What do? Well, at the end of the day, there's only one thing to do, and there's only one thing the voice inside me says, which is get back to work. This is what you do, so do it. I actually grew up in a house with very few books, but there was one that fascinated me in particular. It was a slender, battered paperback that my mother displayed on the mantle of our house next to old family photographs from Iran. The cover showed a woman with coal-lined eyes and bobbed hair, and the Persian script slanted upwards as if the words were flying off the page. That book wasn't just an object, it was an atmosphere. Parting the pages released a sharp, acrid scent that was the very scent of Iran, which was also the scent of time and memory and of loss. I wouldn't know it for a long time, but the woman on that cover of that book, Farrowson, died in a car crash 11 years before my family fled Iran. She was just 32 years old when she died, and when she died, she was the most notorious woman in the country. Her poems were revolutionary. They were a radical bid for self-expression and for democracy written at a time which showed very little tolerance for either of those things, especially when it was women who were calling for them. Like the thousands, hundreds of thousands of other Iranians who left Iran in the late 70s, my family escaped in a hurry. It was 1978. It was a year on the edge of political upheaval. Soon there'd be gunfire and tanks and snipers and dead bodies heaped in the streets. In 1979, no one could know all that, but many people, artists, poets, knew it was coming. That was almost 40 years ago. I was 5 years old. But the details of the night that my family and I left Iran are strangely vivid to me. I remember my grandmother putting me on her lap. There was, the television was on and Gugush was singing. And my mom was packing our suitcases. We only got to take 2. It was winter, the snow was falling in Tehran, and my mother kept saying, "We'll be back soon." She kept saying to my grandmother, "We'll be back soon." Something, though, inside her made her go to the bookshelf and pick up her favorite book. It was a book of poems by Furugh. Something inside of my mother knew that she would need that book. When I was growing up in America, I was made to think that poetry was not useful, that it was dead, or elitist, or decorative. In Iran, meanwhile, there is no higher art. Poets aren't just venerated, they're loved. Everyone seems to have a favorite poet or poem, and they can recite whole poems by heart. Iranians know that when you memorize a poem, it becomes part of you. It becomes part of your body. You carry it with you, even if it's in fragments, and even if it's in another country. So much of my writing as a scholar, but also as a creative writer, has been about Iranian women's lives. And as I was embarking on a project about Iranian women writers in the diaspora, that's us here and outside of Iran, it struck me how often Iranian women bowed their heads or tipped their hats to Furugh. I mean, she came up so often. It was really notable to me. Furugh has been claimed as an inspiration both inside of Iran, since her death, during her life, after her death, and after the revolution, both inside and outside of Iran. And it's really interesting to see the different kind of media. You might have heard there have been plays staged about Furugh. There have been operas written about her. I've heard music set to her poems. I mean, she's really quite strikingly everywhere. Let's get the next one. Let's get Furugh in here. There she is. Furugh, as many of you know, gave Iranian women permission to be bold, to be angry, to be rapturous, to be sinful. She ripped off the silences off of women's writing. She held a mirror up to what Iranian women wanted, what they hoped for, what hurt them. Her work was political and it was also poetic. It was particular and it was universal. It was Iranian, but it was also of the world. So it's not surprising to me that Furugh's poems and her films have become like an axis, a coordinate for Iranian women in Iran and also Iranian women in the diaspora, exploring issues of gender and faith and sexuality and social justice and human rights. It's like we're all gathering at her skirts to tell our stories. This is an image from Furugh's wonderful film. It went underground for, I think, 30 or 40 years. The House is Black, and now you can find it on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. I'll show you a few still shots from that particular film. Let's go maybe to the next one. Next shot as well. This is also from The House is Black. And one more image from The House is Black. There you go. That's the very famous last shot of the film where the lepers, the documentary is about a leper colony, which is really an emblem, a symbol of the Iranian nation, the whole Iranian nation. And at the end of the film, you have this vast number of bodies moving at you and to you, and you learn that the house is black. The country is black. It's fallen into darkness. Next one. So there's Sharina Shaw, and you probably know her. She's hugely successful. She's one of those women who makes my heart fly because I love to see her success so much. Since I know a lot of you know about it, I'll just be very brief. But Sharina Shaw is a filmmaker and an artist. It's very difficult to establish influence on an artist, but in Shireen's case, it's not hard at all to establish Furul's influence on her because she's very explicitly said that Furul is, for her, one of the most important artists to her own work. Nishat has claimed Furul as an inspiration, and she's also adapted Furul's poetry into the body of her own work. Let's go to the next shot, please. Okay, this is an image from a series called Women of Allah that came out in the early 2000s, I think, yeah. And I think it's a really, it's a very, obviously it's a shocking image. In some ways it is representative of Nishat's work because her images are so often black and white. They're playing with themes of violence and silence, of concealment and exposure, of repression and liberation. Nishat herself says, "I see everything in terms of duality. One side never exists without its opposites." Though her films and photographs are thoroughly inhabited by the chador, by the headscarf, her trademark is in ambiguity. She's always playing with you, just a little bit. It's a way of seeing the world that Nishat herself says comes from being an exile, from having come out of the experience of immigration. And it's also an indictment of the very reductive ways that Iranian women are represented in the American media. She wants to complicate what you see. She wants to play with your sense of what you think you know. Nishat said in an interview a few years back, "I've always resisted the Western cliched image of Muslim women depicting them as nothing more than silent victims. My art, without denying repression, is a testimony to unspoken female power and the continuing protest by women in Islamic culture." Let's go to Untitled, the next image. Oh, actually, no, this is not Untitled. That one, there you go. This is also from the Women of Allah series. Perhaps you've seen this image. It's a little bit different from the other pieces in that particular collection because there's no face. You only get part of a face, and the figure that really dominates it is this hand. In the context of the whole work, you might think, because Nishat does often use Quranic excerpts or religious utterances, you might think that what's written on the hand is somehow religious in nature. It's not. Can you read it? It's Furul's poem, I Feel Sorry for the Garden, which is a poem that's, it's really one of her great poems and one of those poems that Iranians can often recite by heart. And what Nishat's done here is on each of the fingers, she's inscribed words from that poem. And if you don't know it, that's a poem that begins, "No one's thinking about the flowers, no one's thinking about the fish, no one wants to believe that the garden's dying, that its heart has grown swollen under the sun, that its mind is being drained of green memories, that its senses lay huddled and rotting in a corner." The garden is a motif that's quite prominent in Iranian literature. I know every one of you has a favorite poem, and that you know, of course, also that this trope of the garden is quite prevalent, and it has one of its uses is to designate the Iranian nation. So the idea of Iran itself as a garden, and I think that's the way that Furul uses it in her great poem, "I Feel Sorry for the Garden." I think one of the things that to me is so moving about this particular image is the kind of unity or bond that you see between Nishat, who's a woman, Iranian woman, living outside of Iran, and she's reaching out her hand, she's stamping her hand with the legacy, with the inheritance of this beautiful poetic tradition. So, let's see. I don't actually remember my mom reading Furul's book when I was growing up. My mom didn't read much when I was growing up. She loved poetry, but she was too busy. My parents ran a motel, and my mom spent her days as a manager in that motel, and she also cleaned the rooms of that motel. She worked really long hours, and when she came home, she'd just lie down on the couch, and maybe she'd put the TV on. There just wasn't time, there wasn't the energy, and maybe there wasn't even the spirit for poetry in my mom's life. Poetry was also connected to a self that she had cast off, and I think somehow it was also painful for her to pick up those books and encounter that self. Still, my mom never gave those books away. And when I went to college, her books, I just stole them. I stole my mom's books, and I took them to college because I was reading wonderful American poets, and I was reading wonderful French poets. But what I really wanted was an Iranian voice. What I really wanted was an Iranian woman's voice. I wanted to see something of myself reflected, and that's what Furul gave me. I'm going to rush along because I've only got 2 minutes here, but I'll tell you a little bit about the novel that I wrote. It's called Song of a Captive Bird, which is a novel about Furul, and it came out of this great desire of mine to find something of myself reflected in poetry. Now, as beloved as Furul is, there's a lot that just wasn't known about her. She died with a lot of her secrets inside her, and there are things that I couldn't conclusively find out when I was doing all of my reading. And so what I decided to do after I published a memoir about my family's life, I decided to write a novel about Furul. I decided to tell her story really to an American audience, because the thing is, hardly any Americans that I tell about Furul had ever heard about her, but they'd all say, "Oh my God, I have to know about this woman. Tell me more about it." So it seemed like there was a lot of interest and hunger, and it was almost like people couldn't imagine that someone like Furul existed ever. And so it became my work to show them that she had, and to show them what she had given to Iran and to Iranian women in particular. So maybe last shot, the one after that. There you go. So this is my book, and it actually gives me chills a little bit because authors really have very little say on the covers of the books. And do you notice there's a striking resemblance between the first image I gave you of the woman in half? The publisher did this. I didn't direct them at all to that image, and it's really sort of fascinating to me that this is the image. There you go. You can see it going back and forth. Yeah. This is the paperback. The hardcover just came out in February, and the paperback comes out in February of this coming year. And this is the cover for that. The cover that's in the book in the hull is a little different. To sort of maybe round things up, I'd say that writing my first book was one of the great gifts of my life, to tell my family story, and writing Furul's story has been also a tremendous gift. For Iranians in America, the last 40 years have felt like an unbroken succession of losses and terrors. The revolution, the Iran-Iraq war, the constant threat of military intervention. For us, the current specter of war stirs up a familiar dread. When I was growing up in the 80s and 90s, America and Iran were almost like magnets opposing each other. But because both countries were part of me, this became the source of pain. Poetry, or even writing, hasn't solved that rift, but it has allowed me to articulate it. And as the prospect of war with Iran grows greater every day, I feel the pull of poetry and of that battered, slendered book that I showed you at the beginning of this talk. For all of its history, in Iran, a poem could get you killed or set you free. When hundreds of thousands of protesters hit the streets in 2009, their chants took the shape of poems, and very often those poems were poems by Furul. If you don't know Furul's poems, there couldn't be a better time to read them. If you read her poems, you'll find not just Iran, you'll find America. If you read her poems, you'll find the very forces that shape this moment here now. Misogyny, censorship, nativism, consumerism, the annihilating violence of war. If you read her poems, you'll find that they, like the best poems, don't offer just an escape from the abuses and terrors of this world, but that they are a repudiation of the forces that make those kinds of abuses possible. Ignorance and the political regimes for which ignorance has been and will always be their life's blood. Thank you for listening to me. And I love the questions.
قبل از هر چیزی ازتون تشکر میکنم تا این ساعت برنامه‌ها رو همراهی کردیم و خسته نباشید بهتون میگم. سخنران این ساعت ما همونطور که میدونید خانم آزاده تبازاده هستن. ایشون نویسنده، ساینتیست و استاد سابق دانشگاه استنفورد. کتاب اسکای دیتکتیو یکی از کتاب‌های ایشون هستش که در سال 2015 توسط نشریه کرتس ریویوز به عنوان یکی از بهترین کتاب‌های سال معرفی شده. اسکای دیتکتیو روایتی است از دوران جوانی و نوجوانی و همچنین شرح دوران پرتلاطم روزهای پس از انقلاب 57، تظاهرات مردم، فرار شاه، اجباری کردن حجاب و شرح تغییراتی که به تدریج بر جامعه ایران سایه افکند و منجر به مهاجرت میلیونی ایرانیان شد. خانم تبازاده در سال 1982 ایران را ترک می‌کنند. در سال 1994 مدرک دکترای شیمی خودشون رو از دانشگاه UCLA دریافت می‌کنند و سپس به عنوان سینیور ریسرچ ساینتیست در ناسا و استاد ژئوفیزیک در دانشگاه استنفورد مشغول به کار میشن. از ایشان بیش از 60 مقاله علمی به چاپ رسیده، همچنین جوایز متعددی از طرف کمیته علمی و بالاترین نشان دولتی به ارزش $500,000 به عنوان دانشمند برجسته دریافت کردند. در سال 2001 بزرگترین جایزه علمی انجمن ژئوفیزیک در آمریکا به ایشون داده شده و بعد به عنوان محقق ناسا به عنوان یکی از 10 دانشمند برجسته آمریکا معرفی شدند. خانم تبازاده ساکن آمریکا هستند و در شهر مانتن ویو زندگی می‌کنند.
نگرفتم. ظهر شما بخیر. میخواستم از ترانه جان تشکر کنم که منو دعوت کرد امروز اینجا با شما باشم و وایدا برای این اینتروداکشن خیلی که تمام چیزا رو براتون توضیح داد و اینطور برای راحت نشان بودم. خیلی ممنون که منو دعوت کردید ترانه جان که اینجا در مورد در مورد داستان زندگی با شما صحبت کنم. من در سال 2015 یک کتاب پابلیش کردم It's called The Sky Detective and بیشتر در مورد خاطراتم توی ایران هست و چطور شد که من وقتی که خیلی بچه کوچیکی بودم 8 سالم بود به دانش خیلی علاقه‌مند شدم و دلیل اون رو براتون بعداً توضیح میدم میشه. و دلیلی که اسم این کتاب هست The Sky Detective در سال 2004 تایم مگزین با من تماس گرفت. ریپورتر ساینس ریپورتر اسمش هست مدلین نش و با من تماس گرفت و از من خواست که این یعنی مقاله تایم مگزین می‌خواست در مورد من بنویسه و در مورد تحقیقاتی که انجام داده بودم و اون موقع من پروفسور ژئوفیزیک بودم توی استنفورد. مدلین فلوین کرد من تو آفیسم و با من صحبت کرد در مورد تحقیقاتم و وقتی داشتم باهاش صحبت می‌کردم فهمید که من از ایران اومدم و خیلی interested بود که بدونه what's the back story, how did I get to this point to be a professor at Stanford. من این مقدار در موردش این براش توضیح دادم که چطور شد من به دانش علاقه‌مند شدم و انقلاب چه تأثیری روی خانم‌ها و بالاخره اون آینده‌ای که برای خودم فکرم بود وقتی که بچه بودم چه تأثیری روی اون زندگی من گذاشته بود. و وقتی مدلاین این آرتیکل اومد توی تایم مگزین توی 2004 پابلیش شد، من خیلی فن میل و ایمیل گرفتم و مردم خیلی در مورد این داستان من براشون خیلی جالب بود و من پالیتیشن هم خیلی بر من لتر و نامه و این چیزا نوشتن و یک کسی که بر من یه نامه خیلی قشنگ نوشت، اون ریچارد دیلی، میر شیکاگو بود توی 2004 و این نامه خیلی قشنگ بر من نوشته بود روی استیشنری شیکاگو، میر آف شیکاگو و خیلی از من تعریف کرد و خیلی از ایرانیا راضی بود و خیلی گفتش که he's very proud of Iranian immigrants and the refugees, Iranian refugees in the United States و خیلی چیزای قشنگی بر من نوشت و به من منو encourage کرد که I have a very good story and I should write my story to humanize people from Iran to Americans and to the Western culture. و این روی من خیلی تاثیر گذاشت. سال 2004 من پروفسور استنفورد بودم و 2 تا بچه کوچیک داشتم. خیلی سرم شلوغ بود ولی شروع کردم کلاسای لیتریچر برداشتم که نوشتنم و کریتیو رایتینگم رو ایمپروو بکنم و شروع کردم شورت استوری نوشتم در مورد زندگی. میشه اسلاید بعد. یه روز فقط خیلی بریفلی در مورد ریسرچ هم بهتون میگم. من سال 1990 شروع کردم، گریجویت استودنت بودم توی UCLA Joint Appointment Between Chemistry and Atmospheric Science و در اون زمان دانشمندا پیدا کرده بودن که یک کمیکالایی که مردم درست کرده بودن، کمیکالایی که مصنوعی هستن، they're synthetic chemicals. they're called chlorofluorocarbons. در حدود 30 سال ما داشتیم اینا رو استفاده می‌کردیم و خیلی کمیکالای خوبی هستن، مثلا توی ریفریجریشن، foam blowing agent, spray, hair sprays, coolant fluids and whatnot. قبل از اینکه این کمیکالا اینونت بشه، به کولنت فلوید مثلا آمونیا استفاده می‌شد یا هیدروژن سالفاید که خیلی بو میدن و خیلی هم اگه اینهیلشون کنین it's not good for your health. ولی این کلوروفلوروکاربن‌ها کامپاندایی هستن که اینرت هستن، اصلا با بدنتون ترکیب نمیشن. مثلا اگه یه ریفریجریتور خونتون داشته باشین که لیک بکنه، این مواد که میاد فقط you breathe it in and breathe it out. There's no impact on your body. خب اینا خیلی تمام دنیا داشت این مواد رو استفاده میکرد و وقتی من شروع کردم graduate research تحقیقاتمو شروع کردم، ما تازه فهمیده بودیم، دانشمندان تازه فهمیده بودن که این مواد خیلی برای محیط زیست دنیا خیلی بده، برای اینکه این کمیکالا خیلی استیبل هستن، هیچی نمیتونه از بینشون ببره. ایونچولی اینا میرن توی اتمسفر زمین و پخش میشن تمام دنیا. و وقتی که پخش میشن کم کم میرن و بالا و میرسن به بالای اتمسفر. مثلا 30 مایل from the surface of the earth یه لایه هست که بهش میگن اوزون لیر. در این لایه اوزون لیر خیلی مولکولای اوزون هست و وقتی که نور خورشید داره به سطح زمین میاد، اون قسمت نور خورشید که بهش میگن ultraviolet C که خیلی harmful هست، تمامش جذب میشه توی اوزون لیر and none of it gets to the surface. و این لایه خیلی مهمه برای بشر و برای محیط زیست. و ما پیدا کرده بودیم، تحقیقاتی که کرده بودیم نشون داده بودیم اینکه این کمیکالا وقتی که به اون لیر میرسن ultraviolet light break downشون میکنه، کانورت میشه به رادیکال و این رادیکالا داشتن اوزون مولکولا رو چو میکردن، این لایه زمین رو داشتن از بین میبردن. و من یکی از اون دانشمندایی بودم که خیلی پیپرهای مهم در مورد این the first global environmental problem before global warming was the depletion of stratospheric ozone or the ozone hole. و من خیلی روی این مسئله تحقیقات کردم و 3 تا سینیر ساینتیست که روی این مسئله خیلی تحقیقات کردن نوبل پرایز کمیستری رو در سال 1994 بردن. اگه میشه بعد من وقتی که این تحقیقات کردم 4 تا پیپر خیلی مهم نوشتم وقتی که گریجویت استودنت بودم. بعد ناسا فوری من هایر کرد وقتی که من از UCLA گریجویت شدم و وقتی که من ناسا بودم سال 1999 دعوت شدم که برم به وایت هاوس که برای این تحقیقاتم یه جایزه از پرزیدنت کلینتون بگیرم. و این The White House هر سال وایت هاوس 30 تا ساینتیست جوان رو انتخاب میکنه که برن اونجا و از پرزیدنت یه اوارد بگیرن برای تحقیقاتی که دارن میکنن که این همونجا میرید، هم توی وایت هاوس میرید اونجا شام میخوری و یه گرانتی مثلا $500,000 به پرزیدنت میده که این تحقیقاتتو ادامه بدی. و من وقتی که رفتم پدرمو با خودم بردم. این پیکچری که شما خیلی براش he's very proud of that moment in his life. وقتی که رفتیم این پیکچر پرزیدنت اوباما سال 2015 اون 30 تا دانشجویی که رفته بودن توی وایت هاوس. اگه میشه اسلاید بعد. ولی این شانس من بود که سال 1999 که اون سالی بود که من رفتم وایت هاوس این جایزه رو بگیرم، فبروری 1999 بود. President Clinton unfortunately was testifying for the Monica Lewinsky scandal. It was a missed opportunity. I was very upset that I didn't get a chance to meet the president. ولی گرانتی که به من داد $500,000 خیلی به من کمک کرد. اینکه من اون موقع 1999 2 تا بچه خیلی کوچیک داشتم و دیگه لازم نبود ویکندام بشینم گرانت بنویسم که ریسرچم رو انجام بدم. و به خاطر این جنراسیتی من در از 5 سال 35 تا پیپر پابلیش کردم و تحقیقاتم رو بردم جلو و جلوتر. اگه میشه اسلاید بعد از 5 سال میذاریم تو 2004 که من این آرتیکل تایم رو در مورد تحقیقات من نوشتم و این خیلی هم روزنامه‌های ایرانی هم international outlets. I did a lot of interviews talking about my research, and that's when I started in 2004 to write my memoir. Copies are over here. این کتاب این کتاب من که این کتاب نوشتم یعنی از پرسپکتیو یه بچه یه دختر کوچیک داره بزرگ میشه تو ایران و این توی با خانواده یعنی interactions between my life and my family و اگه میشه و این من که شروع کردم این کتاب رو نوشتم دیدم که هر وقت که میخواستم یه داستانی بنویسم همیشه نجمه میومد توی این داستانه ما وقتی که پدر من تو ایران خیلی مهندس ساکسسفولی بود ما یه خونه بزرگ تو ایران داشتیم توی شمال هم ویلا داشتیم و اونجا همیشه میرفتیم برای وکیشن و این دفعه که رفته بودیم شمال یه کسی به مادر من گفت که یه دختر روستایی هست که پدرش میخواد اینو بفرسته ایران که کار بکنه و ما رفتیم تو روستا نزدیک رشت بود و نجمه اون موقع 11 سالش بود من 9 سالم بود و نجمه رو آوردیم که دیگه تو خونه ما زندگی میکرد و با من بزرگ شد ولی پدر خیلی خوبی نداشت یعنی هر سال پدر موقعی نوروز میمد پولاشو میگرفت میبرد و اجازه نمیداد که ما نجمه رو بذاریم بره مدرسه ولی من خیلی ریلیشنشیپ خوبی باهاش داشتم و خیلی از نجمه من چیز یاد گرفتم واسه همین این کتاب که میخواست در مورد تحقیقات من باشه وقتی که به آخرش رسید بیشترش در مورد اون missed opportunity to get to know نجمی better در مورد ریلیشنشیپ من شد با نجمه اگه میشه اسلاید بعد نشون بدیم و این کتاب وقتی شروع میشه که من 8 سالمه وقتی 8 سالم بود داییم جیولوژیست بود توی آلمان برای من یه دونه کمیستری کت آورد که خیلی شکل این بود ولی it was a German model و من دیگه از اون موقع یعنی وقتی که داییم اومده بود برای نوروز و مجبورش کردم تمام این مانیول رو از جرمن برای من ترنسلیت کنه به فارسی و من تمام این اکسپریمنت ها رو انجام دادم و واقعا اون موقع بود که من عاشق دانش و عاشق کمیستری شدم و این اگه ببینین این کمیستری ست یه بچه است اصلا این چیزا رو شما دیگه نمیتونین پیدا کنین اگه نگاه کنین اونجا یه بانسن برنر هست که بعد مثلا این کمیکالا رو که میکس میکنین میذارین رو آتیش که مثلا بعضیشون توی آب معمولی حل نمیشه باید آب و مقدارش زیاد اصلا این چیزا دیگه وجود نداره اگه برین تویز آر اس همه چی everything looks cartoonish and boring ولی این کمیستری ست برای یه دختر 8 ساله خیلی چیز جالب بود و it got me hooked basically on science very early on یه میشه اسلاید و اون موقعی که من کمیستری کتو گرفتم سال 1973 بود که پرزیدنت نیکسون پرزیدنت آمریکا بود و ما خیلی ریلیشنشیپ خوبی داشتیم با یونایتد استیتس ولی 4 years later President Carter که was more liberal and he had some issues with the Shah and violation of human rights و خیلی it was not as a smooth relationship as the Shah had with Nixon and the last visit that President Carter came to Iran they had a good meeting and he declared Iran to be a land of absolute peace and stability in the Middle East. 4 months later, as you know, and the revolution happened. There were a lot of protests on the street against the Shah. و این revolution هم یه مقداری از outside the country شروع شد، در اینکه شاه خیلی جوونا رو میفرستاد توی اروپا یا آمریکا که برن educated بشن و برگردن به مملکت و اونا وقتی که خارج از ایران میشدن میفهمیدن که there are some issues with human rights violations in Iran. وقتی که شاه رفت، از خود اینا رو دیگه زیاد توضیح نمیدم، شاه رفت، مردم یه تظاهرات بزرگ شد و آیت الله خمینی 2 هفته بعد برگشت که من هم روزم I turned 14 when he came back and I remember که این وقتی که تو پاریس بود گفتش که من وقتی بیام اصلا به خانم‌ها کاری ندارم، من فقط یه religious figure هستم و I'm gonna just be a religious figure. ولی وقتی که اومد همون روزی که رسید شروع کرد به پریچ کردن که ایران Islamic women should wear the hijab and he was very adamant about it. بعد 2 هفته بعد از اینکه خمینی اومد it was I remember میشه اسلاید بعد که it was in من تازه March 8, 1979 فهمیدم که there is such a thing as an International Women's Day، برای اینکه مادر من خیلی modernized بود و مادر من و دوستاش و دوستای خودم و we all participated in this huge protest. I've never seen something this big in my life. We were all over here protesting against mandatory veiling. And I remember we went to the square where it was the parliament, in front of the parliament, and parliament. Baharistan. And they had actually there was a big program. They had organized a big program, but the revolutionaries had cut all the wires, so none of the microphones worked for the program to go ahead. But people still protested. They marched through the streets. And اینقدر این بزرگ بود که خمینی ترسید از زنها. دیگه he backed off, and the regime got busy interrogating and killing a lot of the Shah's associates for a whole year. And I remember I was 14 years old. Every day I opened a newspaper. There were pictures of dead people, executed people, and I really that left a very bad image in my head that I wrote about in my book. But shortly after that, like 18 months after that, then dating became mandatory, and it was really hard for me. But I defined myself. I was a nerd. I had like a frizzy hair. I put it up in a ponytail. I had glasses. I had an image that went with my love for science and being a nerd. But after revolution, everybody looked the same. Then we went after the veiling became mandatory, and we went to school. Because of all the mabnae and everything, everybody looked the same. They took your individuality away by forcing you to wear the veil, and I was dead against it, and was actually not. My parents were worried that I might not, follow through and get into trouble. And shortly after that, the war broke out between Iran and Iraq, and my brother was just at the right age to go and fight in the war. So we got in the mail draft papers for my brother to participate in the war, and my parents didn't want to have anything to do with this war. So in Alanya picture, I'm 8 years old here, and that's my brother Afshin, and that's my cousin Mama. And I remember right after, a little bit, 6 months after the war broke out, I was passing by my parents' bedroom, and I hear them talking, whispering about smuggling my cousin and my brother through Pakistan. At the time, it was more profitable to smuggle people across the border than to smuggle drugs. So a lot of families who were wealthy send off their sons by smuggling them either through Pakistan or Turkey. And I just marched into their bedrooms, and I just said, that's not fair, because he might die, fighting in the war, but I'm just dying here. I don't want to, and I stopped going to school. I didn't want to wear the veil, and at the time they had closed the universities, because of the war that's going on, there was no future for me. So I made a lot of threats. I said I'm going to run away, and then they decided to put me to make arrangements for me to escape, to cross the border to Pakistan with my cousin and with my brother. This is the last day we were in Iran. I was 17 and the boys were 18 years old. And now that I'm a mother, I think it's very difficult for my mother to let her kids go, because she didn't know what was going to happen to us. So at the smuggling at that time, it was $22,000 per head to smuggle people across the border to Pakistan. So that's next one. And then escape route, at the time, a lot of affluent families send their sons across the border either through Pakistan or Turkey. We went through Pakistan, and it's a very rough train. It was a hard escape, and I talk about that in my book. Can you take to the next step? It was the desert land. We stayed in halfway houses. Go ahead. Halfway houses. We slept in the desert, under the stars. One thing that I remember in Pakistan desert is that I looked up at the sky, because when I was a kid, I was very interested in the stars and the blinking of the stars and identifying various stars. And it had a beautiful, beautiful night sky in the deserts of Pakistan. And then we ran into camel caravans. There was a nomad life in Pakistan. And finally we made it to Karachi. And at the time that we escaped Iran, remember this was right after the hostage crisis, so everybody really hated Iranians at that time, and all countries closed their borders to Iranians, except for Spain at the time, because Juan Carlos, the king of Spain, was good friends of the Shah of Iran when he ruled Iran. So he extended that kindness to Iranians so that we could go to Spain without a visa. So Karachi was a corrupt, but by the time we got tired, we were exhausted, we made it to Karachi, and we had a flight to fly to Madrid, and they wouldn't let us get on the plane. We had to pay the smugglers additional money, no, not the smugglers, but the people at the airport, to let us board the plane to go to Spain. And then we went to Spain. My father had a friend in the United States. He got us an attorney, and it was by a miracle. We went to the embassy 4 months after we were in Spain, when my father's friend came to visit us. And we went to the embassy, and the guy first, it was an African American, he first rejected our request for a visa. But then I started crying, and he felt really bad for us. And then he said, "A young lady, you can go to United," because he gave us a 6-month student visa, and I promised him that if I don't get a renewal of my visa, that I will come back. But I never remember that kind man who gave us the opportunity to come here. And we got our tickets, and when we were flying down, we flew to Los Angeles, and I remember seeing this Hollywood sign that you see in the movies. And from then, I made a promise to myself that I'm going to, do what I want to do and become a chemist. And the rest is what we talk about. And I wanted to write this book. First, I wanted to write, as I mentioned, about my stories, but then I got really hooked in looking at my past. So most of the book is about the life that I lived with Najmi, and how that relationship never ended meaningfully. I never knew what happened to her. She just went missing during the revolution. So this is a tribute to her memory, that there are many girls like Najmi, and she was extremely smart. So I hope that she has a good life now, and I hope we can help to eradicate this type of living all over the world. So because I didn't get a chance to write about my success in the United States, you can't read what I have written over there. But for my next book, I like to talk about and write about succeeding in a male-dominated field in the United States, because that is another struggle for women. It's not easy, but it's doable. I did it. So I often give talks at colleges, talking to young women in the science and engineering fields, and tell them what works and what doesn't. So just a brief, can you show the next slide? It is hard to survive in a male-dominated field, but I never took that personally, because 80% of the colleagues, most of my colleagues were men, and I got along with 80% of them, and they were mentors. They really helped me in my career. But there's always that 20% that make inappropriate comments. They're jealous of you because you're progressing maybe faster than them. And when I went to the White House, I had a very good colleague at NASA. And I worked with him, we wrote papers together. But right before I went to the White House, he told me that I remind him of Forrest Gump. And have you seen that movie? Yes. And Forrest Gump is an autistic person. And he gets moved up in life. And at some point, in his life, he's at the White House shaking President Kennedy's hand. So he was trying to tell me that I got there because I'm a woman, that I don't deserve, going to the White House. And I got very hurt because this person meant a lot to me. But I didn't let that stop me. What I did is that after I came back, I didn't confront him, but I never worked with him again. So there are ways that you can, work with a circle of people, of guys, who support you and who have your back. So it is difficult, but it's doable, and I hope to be able to write about that to guide younger generations in how to deal with some of the issues that you may have in academic and, going in a field that, nobody else looks like you. Thank you very much.